Thank you for joining today's SCORE Institute, Teaching and Tutoring Strategies that Endure. I'm Sharon Roberts, Chief K-12 Impact Officer of the State Collaborative on Reforming Education. Today's Institute will focus on how districts can view their ESSER investments through a Do Now, Build Towards framework as they make choices for how to strategically design and sustainably fund their efforts to establish a strong teacher pipeline and an effective high-dosage tutoring program. The information shared in today's Institute builds on an institute from the past where our partners at Education Research Strategies initially shared the Do Now, Build Towards framework as an approach for districts to consider when making programmatic design and spending decisions, while also taking into account the availability or not of future funding streams. Today, however, we will focus on how this approach connects specifically to strategies related to teacher pipeline and tutoring programs. Education Research Strategies will share with us promising models from their work with diverse and innovative school districts across the country. And we'll also hear from two leaders in Tennessee who are each engaging in the work of designing pipeline and tutoring programs with the goal of sustaining these efforts beyond ESSER funding. First on today's agenda, we'll share some context related to the ESSER plans districts have submitted and their connection to teacher pipeline and tutoring programs. We'll then hear from David Rosenberg, a partner at Education Resource Strategies, who leads their human capital practice with a deep focus on helping leaders make the teaching job more rewarding and collaborative. David will provide an overview of the Do Now, Build Towards framework and share specific insights into promising and sustainable teacher pipeline trends and tutoring program models that they've observed in their work across the country. Next, I'm honored to be joined by Joey Hassell, the superintendent of Haywood County Schools, and Jerry Boyd, the superintendent of Washington County Schools, as they share real examples of how Tennessee districts are designing and implementing a Grow Your Own program and a high-dosage tutoring program in their schools with a focus on continuous improvement and sustainability for the long term. After they share, we'll set aside some time for them to respond to any questions from the audience throughout the call. Please feel free to submit those questions throughout the webinar as the presenters are sharing or during the Q&A portion toward the end of the webinar. You can do this by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Finally, we'll close out by highlighting a few planning resources that we will share following our call today, along with a link to sign up for a follow-up call if you'd like to connect with someone at SCORE about the content of the webinar and how it may apply to your district context. As you know, COVID-19 significantly impacted student achievement over the past 2 years. The 2021 statewide assessment showed dramatic proficiency losses for all grades in English Language Arts, ELA, and math. Performance declines in math were double the drops in ELA. In 2021, the math proficiency rates for grades 3 through 8 decreased by 12.1 percentage points. In ELA, proficiency rates in grades 3 through 8 decreased by 5.4 percentage points. In an effort to support districts and schools with the critical task of helping students and educators recover from the disruptions caused by the pandemic, Congress passed 3 pieces of legislation appropriating nearly $200 billion in federal funds to the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, known as ESSER. The purpose of this fund is to support schools to safely reopen and to recover from the impacts on student learning. And importantly, it gives LEAs a great deal of latitude in spending these dollars, showing them to be responsive to the most pressing needs, allowing them to be responsible to the most pressing needs of their students. To support districts with ESSER planning decisions, the Tennessee Department of Education created a spending plan template based on 4 focus areas: academics, student readiness, educators, and foundations. Through an analysis of these spending plans, SCORE was able to create a district-level dashboard with the goal of supporting leaders in reflecting on their allocations to each focus area and making potential adjustments to best support recovery in their districts. Through our analysis, we found that district plans centered on both using funds to address immediate pandemic-related challenges, as well as seizing this opportunity to develop innovative and sustainable programs that support ongoing improvement for teaching and learning. Today, we will specifically focus on 2 examples of research-based innovative programs implemented by Tennessee school districts: high-dosage tutoring and teacher pipeline strategies. From our analysis, we found that districts across the state plan to invest nearly 6.5% of ESSER funds in tutoring, 2.6% of funds on educator recruitment, and another 0.3% on Grow Your Own programs. However, these programs not only require funding, but they also require adjustments or additions to staff capacity and the strategic reimagination of structures to support their integration into a more coherent, student-centered system. And now I'm pleased to introduce David Rosenberg, who will provide the national context for the Do Now, Builds Towards framework and examples of its strategic application to support teacher pipelines and high-dosage tutoring strategies. David is a partner at ERS, providing strategic counsel to state and local education leaders across the country. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, David helped lead development of ERS tools and guidance for national, state, and local leaders as they implement strategies for recovery and long-lasting system redesign. We hope today's webinar will provide you with the opportunity to learn more about promising work across the country and in Tennessee as we reflect on your current approach to allocating ESSER funding to support student learning now and in the future.
Sharon, thank you. And it is wonderful to be with this group today. I'm going to just quickly pull up a discussion document for us. I appreciate the time that all of you are spending here and doing the challenging work that you are doing today. In the next few 30 minutes or so, would love to cover a few topics. I want to build on Sharon's introduction and thinking about what Do Now, Build Toward looks like in the context of particularly around teaching, tutoring, and teaching role. We'll put this in the context of Tennessee, so a little bit of what you see number 3, innovations we're seeing around the country, but make the connection to what's happening in the volunteer state. And then translate that to some reflection questions that I think could lead nicely into what we'll hear from Superintendent Boyd and Superintendent Hassell, who we've had the privilege to work with over the course of the last several months. So just to recap and connect to where we are in Tennessee, the funding that we have through ESSER has come in these different tranches, as you know, and it plays out over several years. What this really means is that for a typical, if there is such a thing, high poverty school district, this is the equivalent of increasing your annual budget by 10 to 15% for each of the next of 3 years. And then of course the dollars go away. That's a significant new investment, right? We often in our school districts think about, wow, do we get a 2 to 3% bump in revenue, or do we have a 1 or 2% decline in revenue? And that can have a really big impact. So this is, as I know you all are experiencing, quite sizey, which creates tremendous opportunity, but also of course challenge in how do we do the right thing and accomplish as much as we aspire to. So early on in this work, we developed and shared these 7 principles for investing federal stimulus dollars. It obviously starts, and when we initially built this over a year ago, with the vision piece, how do we decide what it is we want to do? But ultimately, this has always had this build toward idea of what does long-term sustainability look like, and how do we create the kind of conditions that make change stick, right? Everybody has an example of something that happens in your system that has stuck and is impossible to change. How do we make the good stuff stick, right? Not just the conditions and the challenges that we have. I want to name really early here, we called this Principles for Investing Federal Stimulus Dollars. This applies to any infusion of funds that you get. And as we talk about what may be coming down the pike in Tennessee, that's particularly relevant to keep in mind, because unlike in most other states, a lot of what we're talking about is not just going to be about the next couple of years. It's going to be about how we leverage whatever comes out of the legislature and Department of Education in the next several weeks. I want to focus our conversation today on some of these middle pieces, particularly sort of what are these types of proven high impact strategies that we call power strategies? Where does the tutoring work and work on reimagining the teaching job fit within there? And then we'll sort of work our way down the path towards sustainability. So when you get a new infusion of funds, typically, one of three things is going to happen. The first scenario is you get the money, and then you stop doing the thing you did, right? So what you see here is the light green here represents what was your budget before new funds. And the blues is it a mix of recovery strategies, or am I actually doing something to redesign student experiences? And we've all seen this movie before for scenario one, right? You get the grant, you do the thing, the grant runs out, you stop doing the thing, and you're right back where you started. That was nice while it lasted. This is clearly not what we aspire to in the current world. Scenario two is was sometimes called rolling the dice, right? We ramp some things up, maybe we scale back over time, and then we say, we'll get the money. Let's do our politics. Let's work with the legislature. Let's work with the mayor, wherever our sources of funds are, and see if we can figure it out later. So we're willing to bake in some new funds. That's rolling the dice because it's high risk, right? We don't know that those new funds are going to come. And certainly is not a way to keep your CFO sane and happy, let alone know that what you're doing is gonna be lasting. So then we talk about the scenario three, which is we talk about sustaining innovation and what does that mean for sustainable redesign. And so this is the hardest scenario, but it's also the most powerful where we can make it work, right? It enables us to both build recovery strategies and redesign strategies and replace some of our old legacy non-strategic investments with new strategic investments in things that we've gotten to test during ESSER, and then continuously improve to the point where they work. The con, of course, is that at some point you've got to make a trade-off. Something in the green has to go away, right? To be replaced by the light blue. But if the light blue work, the redesign work is meaningfully better and right for kids, then that's the right idea. But it's that when we get to sustainability, that's where the rubber hits the road. So now let's put this in your context in Tennessee. We are all asking the question to get to that sustainable redesign. What do we want to be true for our students in 2025 and what school looks like that wasn't true before the pandemic? That's the stuff that we want to stick, right? And that's the sustainable redesign that should be grounded in the power strategies that we'll talk about. Now, here in Tennessee, we've got a potential, depending on what happens legislatively, with a little bit of a variant that could have a really big impact on your planning, right? So the typical scenario three is I have to get back to net zero. And if you were seeing declining enrollment, by the way, you might have to get back to net less than 100% of what you had before. Depending on what happens with TISA, it is possible that some districts will end up with more revenue post-pandemic than they had pre-pandemic, still less than ESSER, but a more stable financial position than they were, say, in 2019. So this is great, right? If it works out this way, more funding allocated by student need, it makes that cliff smaller, right? We don't have to think about how do we just reduce our budget by 15 or 20% immediately. But it does potentially reduce the pressure that we need to focus on redesign rather than just adding stuff, right? And we know, as we'll talk about in a second, adding stuff is often the easiest strategy to pursue. It's a very natural thing to do. but it doesn't necessarily change the experience of students in the ways that we need to, and the experience of educators in the ways that we need to get to the vision that most leaders we work with outline and aspire to. So that pressure to address some near-term needs can get in the way of change. And I want to particularly call out two pieces here that are very relevant in the moment. One is the recovery aspect of the work hasn't gone away, right? We're in a little bit of a better period now in most communities, but it wasn't that long ago in January, February that it felt like we were back in the early days of the pandemic. And so focusing on the immediate and the urgent can really make it difficult for a leadership team to focus on longer term planning. And then of course, we have this historic premium on spending new dollars on staff positions in schools. It's a common need, right? If I have more need in my school, if I see more challenge, what's the natural response? Well, I need another person here to help me do the work. The challenge, of course, is again, that is just it doesn't necessarily change the experience of kids. And to illustrate this, I'd like to briefly share some national data from before the pandemic. And obviously every community is a little bit different, but as a nation, over the 25 years between 1990 and 2015, we increased per pupil spending on K-12 education by 35%. Now, that is not going to be true in every system. It may not feel true in your system because for a variety of reasons, but nationally, this is what we did. And so when we looked at the data, we said, well, gosh, where did all the money go? What did we do with that? And the answer is more than half of it went to staff, and most of that was in schools. We'll look at that a little more closely in a second. Benefits costs are significantly higher than they were. That's healthcare. And then there's a smattering of other stuff. Purchase services is people like us, right? You're buying capacity, buying new resources, tuition, supplies, other costs that get taken on. You'll notice, of course, salaries have not increased, which is a surprise to nobody in the system. But to dig in a little bit more on the 50% of this new investment that went to schools, what does that mean in a typical American school? There is such a thing. So I want you to imagine a school of 500 kids, right? The average school in America. In 1990, that school had 55 staff members, including 29 teachers. In 2016, that school had 62 staff members. And most of the increase came from aides and other support staff, not from teachers or other instructional staff. And we're not including aides and instructional staff for this purpose, although obviously they can play a critical role. And so we are taking this foray into the national data and history for a moment to recognize the fact that adding resources, adding people is not an illogical strategy, but it is basically a version of what we have done in the country over the last 30 years. And most folks would say we haven't really changed the student experience and made teaching a stronger profession in the ways that we need to over the last 30 years. And what's the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. The challenge is that if we add resources without changing the way we do the work and changing the day-to-day experience of students and educators, we're not really changing, we're less likely to change outcomes. And so back to the current moment, we have the challenges wrought by the last couple of years. And these are the things that we hear from district leaders around the country. Right? A recognition that instruction will not and should not look the same, that we have to redefine what normal is and get to a new normal that is a lot more innovative. And we have to do so in a period where student need is different in most communities than it was before. It has been magnified. And we've seen lots of examples, of course, of how sort of the soft underbelly of American society in terms of where need was greatest before has been more fully sort of magnified during the pandemic. And so how do we support students and families through that work? This calls for a different approach. So what should that different approach be? So at ERS, we started taking a step back and saying lots of the answers exist. Let's home in on the ones that have the greatest potential for impact now and in the future. So we call these power strategies. They're research-based. They are focusing on both academic and social emotional needs for kids. They require tackling underlying cost structures, which is the way you make them sustainable. But again, that's back to the trade-offs, which can be difficult. And they can meaningfully help us realize a vision for students and teachers that fulfills our collective hopes and expectations for what school can be, not necessarily what it has been, but what we can create for the next generation and the current generation of kids. So we've boiled this down to 5 power strategies, and I'm sharing this as context for the deeper dive we're going to do on tutoring and teacher pipelines. So the first one here is the basics of empowering adaptable instruction. You got to have the right curriculum. You got to have time and support to be able to use it well. If you don't have that, then everything else is a little bit nipping around the edges. So that's first and foremost. We've got to target time and attention. Not every student needs exactly the same thing. So what does that look like, particularly for students with the greatest learning needs? Third, we got to think about the teaching job and what are the ways in which we can restructure teaching to be more rewarding, collaborative, and sustainable while enabling excellence and growing and diversifying the workforce. We know we have to focus on social emotional support and relationships, and we are deliberate about saying relationships because while some of this is about sort of responsive, reactive support through specialists, a big part of this is also thinking about how many students does a teacher support in high school? What does a schedule look like, and when do students have opportunities to build meaningful relationships with adult mentors and people they can look up to in their schools? And the last piece is community and family partnerships, and a recognition that if you go back to 2020, and nobody really wants to, but if you think back to that, we learned really quickly that learning doesn't stop at the schoolhouse door, right? Families got engaged, partners got engaged, other out-of-school resources were engaged by necessity in ways that actually could be quite beneficial if we can sustain it. So when we think about these power strategies, now let's put it in the Tennessee context. In Tennessee, in the plans that we looked at, and these are ESSER plans, not actual spending, as is true nationally, about half of districts' ESSER investments are going towards some version of these power strategies. The other half is going towards facilities, technology, health and safety, assorted other factors, which is still a significant chunk of change we're talking about. So in the state of Tennessee, of course, you've doubled down in a couple of areas, right? One, time and attention, that's where tutoring fits in, right? And so we have evidence that the state's emphasis through all core and the funding associated with it has led an awful lot of districts to not just pursue tutoring, but to pursue it using research-based best practices. But we also know that right now, we still have a mix of investments in short-term strategies and long-term solutions, right? Substitutes, teacher bonuses are more short-term strategies, thinking about ways we retain teachers, how do we build new pipelines, how do we support and build capacity among teachers. Those have the potential to pay benefits in the long run. And then, of course, thinking more about the teaching job itself, we have the emphasis on grow your own strategies that are emerging in Tennessee ahead of the rest of the country, and has the one way in which we have the potential to really build some momentum around diversifying and expanding the workforce. So let's tie this back to do now and build toward, and think about it in the context of time and attention. If my build toward vision for ensuring that kids get the right amount of time and attention involves things like extended time, high dosage tutoring, really small class sizes and priority grade levels, whether that's early grades or transition grades, thinking about what were the benefits of online learning. There are obviously lots of challenges, but we also see there's certain contexts in which it can work fairly well. How do we think about creating new experiences for high school students, particularly as they move beyond 9th and 10th grade? And so if our vision, and it's going to vary from community to community, but if our vision starts to include things like that, that implies some do now investments that don't flip the switch to get all the way to build towards, but can be accessible for us in the near term. And that's where we see things like, let's revise our schedule and change the way we use instructional time in certain grade subjects in schools. Let's think differently about the staff that we have to engage and support small group instruction, even if it's not a traditional teacher. And let's focus on high dosage tutoring for a subset of students, and we'll hear more about that in an example in a moment. Tutoring, by the way, I should say, can come in a wide range of formats. And I just want to highlight two examples from outside Tennessee very briefly. In what we'll call District A here, they've gone down the path of saying, we're just going to create a portfolio of providers. We're going to vet them. We're going to make sure they're available. We'll do the RFP. We evaluate them closely. And then we're going to say, okay, students, families, all of these are available to you. And we've vetted the ones that we think are quality. Let's help match you to the program that you need. If your student is in elementary school and is working on reading skills, we have the model that works well for that. And so we're putting a lot of money to reach students in a subset of our schools in order to fund that, right? So the families don't have to pay for it. We're just going to match them up and help them take advantage of the resource. What we'll call District B here has said, we're going to be really targeted about this. We're going to focus on secondary reading and math. We're going to go for 2 to 3 hours a week during the school day. We're going to have a single partner that recruits tutors. It's going to be in person, and the school leader and their team is going to figure out how to deploy the resources. So lots of different ways to go at it, all of it under the rubric of tutoring. Tutoring is one critical way to think about time and attention, but we'd really encourage folks to think about what does it mean for the schedule and staffing beyond just the tutoring. So this is an example from Aldine, Texas, a large district serving a very diverse, high poverty group of students. And they've gotten really creative with how they think about planning time and what that means for students. And so in their case, they've actually bundled planning time to enable long collaboration blocks for teachers, which, as we see in Teaching Job in a second, is really good for teachers if done well. But that also gives them an opportunity to do something different for kids, and that different could be a form of tutoring. In this case, it happens to be more of a project-based learning model with a subset of teachers and out of school, high school student volunteers. But you can do all kinds of things if you free up the time. And so this is a way to think about, well, if we think differently about the people we have and the time that we have, what can we open the door to? If you're trying to build out a tutoring model, this is one sort of other example to think about. Okay, let me pivot us into the teaching job piece of this, which is interesting because it leads us to start thinking about educators and their impact on students rather than starting with students. But the goal is the same, right? To create richer, more engaging, more supportive, and impactful experiences for all of our kids. So as we think about this, let's just think about our teachers and the crisis of the teaching job that we have all inherited over the last several years. We've got an increasingly diverse world. We've got very collaborative workplaces, rising wages for professionals, career paths. People change jobs many times over their career, but the teaching job is kind of unchanged. It's kind of one size fits all. It's designed to be sort of the same in most places, right? One teacher, one classroom, 30 kids, 25 kids. As we saw, pay hasn't increased. Still, you have to work hard to make it not a solitary job. And so this has contributed to burnout, turnover, staff shortages. And then when we introduce a crisis like COVID, really difficult to manage that, right? And our capacity. And most importantly, it affects students, right? Students don't have access to the consistently great teaching that they need in order to thrive. So if you think about those 7 principles for leveraging new funding, it starts with building a vision, and we can think about a vision for the teaching job a little bit differently than the status quo. We can think about it as a job or profession that is more flexible and dynamic, that is more rewarding, that is a big emphasis on teamwork and collaboration with expertise at the table, that is sustainable, right? I can handle my workload. I don't have to joke about what's a teacher day. The teacher day is the day that you never get to stop and go to the restroom or eat your lunch. Like, we shouldn't have that for teachers. And the profession is set up to be increasingly diverse in terms of who we attract into the profession, which is both about expanding pipelines, but also about acknowledging that we have some barriers to entry and some biases that are embedded in systems that aren't helping, right? And so how do we address those as well? Because we know teachers have the greatest impact on student outcomes, we have to think, well, as part of that vision, what do students need? Teachers with energy, time, tools, ability to engage them really well, teachers who don't leave, and teachers who on a day-to-day basis have the time and space and knowledge to empathize with and connect to each student as an individual. The current teaching job, as it is structured in most communities, requires teachers to be heroes to be able to accomplish what students need from them. In a sector, a profession with 3.5 million people, there's not 3.5 million excellent anythings in the United States of America. It's too big. And so we have to create a context in which more teachers can be successful. And Lord knows it doesn't mean changing our standards, right, for what excellence looks like. But we have to create a context where achieving excellence is more feasible for more teachers. And we are organized to make that happen in ways that keep teachers engaged with kids. So back to our idea of some examples nationally. One way you can think about this is how do you move from sort of individual job to a teaming job, right? As we think about what does it mean to expand our pipelines, what are we bringing teachers into that, because every recruitment challenge is a retention challenge at its core. So how do we move from, and you can, from a typical, very individual experience to an experience where the teachers are deliberately organized as a team, and not a team because they're called a team, or not a team because there's a team lead in name, not a team because they have a team meeting once a week, but because they're actually collaborating to do the work. They're dividing the work, they're sharing lesson planning and student data review conversations. They have the opportunity even to flexibly regroup kids across, and they have some mentorship and coaching from somebody on the team who's really good with the content that's being taught, right? So that gives me as a new teacher a context in which I can be more successful in sharing the work and getting more support in a job embedded way. When I think about expanding pipelines, we think about a bunch of factors here. We have to have a diverse portfolio of pathways, right? It's not going to be that we just get teachers from one source. Grow your own programs are part of that. We have to reduce barriers to entry. We make it really hard to become a teacher. The Teacher of the Year in Massachusetts this year, where I live, took 3 tries to pass her state test to become a teacher. And now she's Teacher of the Year, right? So there's a disconnect that sometimes exists there. We don't lower standards, but we have to make it possible for people who can be excellent to get into the role. We have to reduce barriers. We need to provide expert support that is job embedded. And we need incentives to stay. The idea that you don't get a meaningful raise for 8 or 10 years, as exists in some communities, is a really tough way to say to somebody, we value you and the investment we've made in you in your first couple of years. We got to figure out, how do we keep people? And mathematically, one of the best things we can do for our students is to ensure that good teachers don't leave after a couple of years. So that's about changing the experience of teachers overall. Last example I want to share here comes out of Arizona State University, the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, where they have an initiative you may have heard of called the Next Education Workforce. And they basically go all the way. They say, we want teaming, we want differentiated roles, we want to think differently about who's in the classroom. We even get to the place of saying we literally are going to knock down some walls to facilitate collaboration and more flexible grouping. And it's really interesting to start to hear from educators in some of these buildings, because even mid-year, you start to hear people say, I would never go back to closing my door and doing my job the way I used to do it before. And so the potential for redesign in this moment, with ESSER funds, with the challenges that we have, and with the vision that folks are building, is really powerful. And our moment here is to figure out how we take advantage of that. So where do you start? The work is big, right? If I think about the next education workforce, like this can look like a fairly radical change for an individual educator, let alone a whole school building, let alone multiple school communities within a system. So we've got this idea that you can choose your spot through which you enter this work, your do nows essentially, and move toward your build towards, if you start with a particular flavor of the work, right? So think of a catalytic entry point different from a typical pilot, where I might say, I'm going to do a thing, I'm going to introduce a resident, I'm going to build a team, I'm going to create a leadership role for 4 teachers in one school, and I'm going to do it sort of in spite of the way my system typically works. A catalytic entry point is designed to leapfrog that and say, it's got to be big enough to pass a bar for innovation, even though it is one step along a bigger process. So it's that middle ground. And so a catalytic entry point for reimagining the teaching job would include this rigorous focus on teaming and sharing work, this notion that we have shamelessly borrowed from the team in Nashville of every student known, which is a way of thinking about not just social emotional supports, but teacher assignments, schedules, use of time. Time for teachers, not just for planning, but for reflection and restoration to maintain their energy and to do the work that they need to do to be excellent in the classroom with their students. And as I alluded to earlier, it's got to be built on a foundation of strong curricula, great teaming, great teams, great experienced folks, great collaboration. Working off of the wrong curriculum obviously is going to leave a ton of value on the table. And as leaders, this also means not just choosing the spot, but ensuring that we are thinking about not being too narrow, right? Focusing on multiple dimensions of what the job is, thinking about what we have to do at a system level to make the new thing the easiest thing, not an exception, and thinking not just about what it is we want to do in that entry point, but what's going to come next, right? What are the ideas that what is our build toward vision going to include? And let's not just say this is a springboard or a first step. Let's start to paint a picture of what the next step could look like, even while we're still doing the first step, right? So we see a roadmap of where we're going that doesn't just say, well, we'll do the thing, hopefully it'll work, and then poof, we'll scale it, right? We're trying to actually build more fundamental change here. So just to conclude this part of our conversation, and I know we've covered a lot of ground quickly, and I am super excited to hear from Superintendent Hassell and Superintendent Boyd, as I'm sure you are. The principles for investing new funds to pursue a do now, build toward approach really is about building your big vision, focusing on strategies that are proven, and then doing the work of designing the student and teacher experience and the way people and time are organized. And then thinking as you do that about, well, how am I going to make trade-offs to make sure that I can continue to do this if it works, which is the last point on this of defining success, measuring, and adjusting, right? Because I want to get to a place in the build toward where the best thing, the thing that works, has been tested. It's based in research. It's working in my system, and probably not because I got it perfectly right the first time, but because I kept at it. I've adjusted the way I do business to make that work core. And because it's so powerful, it has been easier to, but I'm still willing to make the trade-offs, which will still be difficult, to not do something I was doing before that turns out to be a legacy investment that really may not be helping me as much with my vision as the new work that we're doing. So last piece here, some questions I'd encourage you to think about as we hear from our district leaders and then move into conversation and then take it back with your teams. Let's apply that all in the context of Tennessee, where you've got a particular set of investments, you've got a state role that is guiding you and providing incentives down certain paths. You're really at the leading edge of what's happening around the country in many ways, and some districts have the potential, depending on legislative action, to have less of a sort of an ESSER cliff. It really starts with, what do we want to be true for students in 2025 that wasn't true before the pandemic? Let's build that vision. Let's use the research-based strategies to flesh out that vision. And if you flesh out the build toward of that vision, then you can backwards plan the do now actions, or the catalytic entry points. In knowing that can help us say, what's the stuff that's got to stick? Let's think now about trade-offs that we're going to make, because you're going to start making them soon, so you don't have to do it all at the end. And let's be really clear that great work rarely is stuff that you got right the first time. So how do we approach the work knowing we're going to have to focus on continuous improvement so that we have work that we want to sustain? And we do have that vision coming to life, where what's true for students in 2025 is different and better than what was true for students in 2019. So with that, let me pause. Thank you, team, for the opportunity. I hope this was a helpful setup, and I'm super excited for the rest of our conversation. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you, David. You've really challenged our thinking, and we thank you for that. And also thank you for your investment in Tennessee districts over the last few months. So if you have questions for David, please go ahead and submit those using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And we'll also return to those questions during our Q&A portion toward the end of the session. Now I'd like to turn it over to one of the first of our two districts we're highlighting today, my friend Joey Hassell, superintendent of Haywood County Schools. He's going to share with us ways in which Haywood County has prioritized a growing your own model, and they're thinking around how to sustain it in the future. Joey, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
All right. Good morning, Sharon. Thank you for the opportunity to be with everyone today and just share some insight to some of the things we're doing in Haywood County to think about prioritizing a strong teacher pipeline, investing in teacher diversity, and then how we're using multiple grow your own options to address some of the challenges we face with staffing our schools. As we started planning and working with education resource strategies over the 6-month period, this was a conversation that came up multiple times. Every time we were on a call, whether it be with the other districts participating or specifically with the ERS team. And we historically, struggled in hard to staff areas, math, science at the secondary level, sometimes middle school, some of the special education areas. But over the last few years, especially during the time with COVID, we've even seen struggles to staff K-6 or pre-K-6 in some areas. So it really gave us an opportunity to think about this and how we wanted to prioritize a strong teacher pipeline. One of the things Education Resource Strategies did for us was they did an analysis to really look deeply at our employment data over the last 5 years, and it gave us a detailed picture of our overall strengths, needs, and areas of growth. And these areas of growth for recruitment and retention helped us focus as we think about our strategies moving forward. And with the HR team of one, it's hard to take that analysis and we look at our data every year in personnel decisions we make, we think about those things, but to have this detailed analysis really helped us. So we learned several things through the analysis that was completed. And one of those was that our district-wide turnover over the last 4 years is roughly about 17%. And you'll see where with the ERS analysis of 15 districts nationwide, it ranged from 6 to 26%, a median of 14%. So we were slightly above that median percentage. And so if we lose 17% of our teachers every year, and then it's hard to staff, we're definitely digging a hole that we have to think differently about. So several things that we took away. One, we did see that our teachers with the higher effectiveness scores are retained compared to those with lower effectiveness scores. So our teachers in that 4 to 5 range on our team evaluation were being retained and were choosing to stay with us. We did see that turnover at our secondary level was almost double what we were having at the elementary level. And then the trends of the turnover at the secondary level, we did see shifting of higher retention rates for more experienced teachers. So if a teacher was with us at the secondary level and got past year 3, they were more likely to stay with us. So those were strong analysis that we received. And with that, one big takeaway, and we'll shift to our slide talking about investing in teacher diversity. We realized specifically that our teacher workforce was becoming less diverse over time. And this is important for all students, but it's specifically important for the students in Haywood County. We are a majority minority district, and we need more Black educators in front of our students. And what we saw is that more Black teachers were leaving each year than were being hired, which resulted in a decrease in representation. And we know from the research the important role that having teachers who look like your students, that results in better outcomes. So, and our population is roughly 66%, and you'll see 66% minority, and you'll see that 25% of our teachers identified as Black or African American. So we it was a gut check, and we knew that we had to commit to facing the challenge of achieving a workforce that resembles our student body. So as I shared earlier, we have a human resource department of one. So when we really lack the capacity to really look at turnover rates and really examine things deeply like ERS provided us. But what this did specifically for us was to show us that 25% teacher percentage for Black or African American versus 66% student population was a gap that we definitely needed to address. So with that, we've shifted our thinking to thinking about grow your own, which is the next slide that we have. And we're looking at this through multiple pathways. One, we want to recruit and train highly qualified candidates from within our own community. And we believe that Haywood County can meaningfully diversify its teacher workforce through this. So we're looking specifically at our non-certified Haywood County Schools staff and educational assistants. We're also looking at high school students and teaching as a pathway, or teaching as a profession pathway. And then for the areas of hard to staff like math, science, special education, ESL endorsements, we're thinking about current certified staff. So one example is we have some solid 5th, 6th grade math teachers who've actually signed up to be in the States. Grow your own opportunities to add the math or science endorsements to help us in those areas. But with that, we'll create opportunities in the K-6 realm. So that's where we're really thinking about our non-certified staff and our educational assistants and high school students. So what we want to do is to create opportunities where our students, and when I say students, I'm talking about our staff, they will have an opportunity to pursue coursework to obtain certification. For our high school students, we want to bring them on as educational assistants and let them complete the coursework to obtain certification. And as I previously said, our certified staff having that shot to pursue additional endorsements. So we have multiple educational assistants that we've onboarded as teachers over the last few years, and they've been very successful. And we know, we know their attendance, we know their work ethic, we see them engage with our students through tutoring and intervention and in our inclusion model. So really all we need to do is to create an opportunity for them to pursue the certification and a degree so that they can grow their content knowledge, instructional strategies, and other supports to make them successful. And the same with the high school students that we will on board. I would share here briefly that Clarksville, Montgomery County was very helpful, and Sharon connected us with Sean, the chief academic officer, and we worked closely with them, and they've shared resources with us. So reaching out to Clarksville, Montgomery, even though they're much larger than us, has helped us kind of focus our energy there. So as we shift, we're going to think about how we're going to plan for future cohorts. And so we know that it's a challenge for us, our size, to constantly reflect and think about what staffing needs are. But we know that we have to leverage this do now, build toward approach and think about some of the ESSER resources that we have. So when we think about sustainability and growing this, we're going to look at ways to connect our students, whether they will be adult learners or high school graduates going into our EA roles. We're going to look at opportunities for them to fill financial gaps with Tennessee Reconnect, our Pell Grants, Hope Scholarship, and Tennessee Promise. So we're going to work closely with Jackson State Community College to move into the associates program and then move to a partnership with either University of Tennessee Martin, University of Memphis, or Tennessee State for that initial bachelor's degree. We're going to start slow and then just really build this first cohort and walk them through the associates before we onboard any more students. So we're going to recruit a little more. We need to keep probably 12 to 15 in a cohort. So we're looking to recruit about 20 folks. And then once we see where our attrition lands, we will we'll work through the associate's degree and then start another cohort, but we want to be very intentional in that work. And then finally, we just want to continue to build and deepen relationships with our post-secondary institutions in our region. We think focusing our energy in this area will do multiple things. One, we will be, giving our graduates opportunities to pursue education. Two, we'll be creating opportunities for our EAs to be certified and earn more. And we will also be putting quality folks in front of our students. So thank you, Sharon, for the opportunity for me to share kind of what we're doing in rural Haywood as it relates to grow your own.
Thanks, Joey. I appreciate it so much. Your district's efforts to reflect on teacher retention data and make concrete plans to address gaps that you have is so inspiring. And I hope other districts joining today or who will listen to this webinar later will start to think about more deeply about the health and diversity of their teacher pipelines and engage in this work like you all have. If you all have questions for Joey, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Now I'd like to turn to another friend of mine, Superintendent Jerry Boyd from Washington County Schools. Jerry and his team are doing an incredible work to implement high-dosage tutoring program and thinking strategically about how to serve students now while also designing a program that will be sustainable beyond the infusion of ESSER funds. Jerry, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Sharon. Certainly a great honor and privilege to just spend some time today sharing some work we're involved in. Before I get too far down, I just want to compliment Joey and his team on the great work they're doing around retention and growing that pipeline of teachers. We're all watching closely, and certainly the work previously that's done by Clarksville, Montgomery County, and some other districts. We certainly want to leverage that great work to implement the same, very similar approaches. Our focus, as David mentioned too, in line with our work with DRS, time and attention to our students was a great focus of ours, like I know it is in your districts as well. But, as we all experienced the challenges through the pandemic, in trying to have those discussions about what we're going to do to address what people refer to as learning loss, of course, or I prefer to just say we need to accelerate their learning based on some instructional missed opportunities for instruction or just that consistency. So our conversation was around high dosage tutoring, low ratio, high dosage tutoring, really focused on the students' needs. We began a conversation just looking at our existing structures. And knowing we needed to do something immediately, we had the great benefit of a regional partner that was already engaged in the work around high dosage tutoring, a nonprofit that serves this Northeast Tennessee region unbelievably well. And through that partnership, we were able to launch immediately some after school tutoring focused primarily on K-3 and literacy. As we expand that work, we're going to expand it up the grades and also into math. So we have both ELA and math opportunities to address. The big thing that we want to see happen in our vision, as has been said, you need to set the vision. And as our team, we felt like after school is certainly a needed option for students, but until or unless we make it become a part of our regular school day, we couldn't, meet the needs of all students. So our work's been heavily focused on how are we going to bring the option of high dosage tutoring into our school day, working with our existing staff, but also knowing our capacity with our existing staff. Certainly the abilities there, it's just the just human capacity. Can they do more than they already are doing? And the question is not likely. So we know we have to look at other resources. Initially, of course, going to be supported by ESSER dollars, but we want that long-term sustainability with those, with our continuing funds outside of ESSER. So we're really thinking about another topic that was hit on too, around the new vision for teachers. So at the same time, we're thinking about restructuring how we better support students during the school day using high dosage tutoring. We know that the teacher jobs, we have to look at that, and it's going to have to change over time too to sustain that. So, looking at teaming of teachers, looking at more specialized areas for individual teachers, that differentiation is certainly something we're in the middle of exploring, and hopefully over time we'll fully implement. But, I just wanted to address the why, and really I don't have to spend a lot of time on that. I believe everyone on this call knows the urgency that we have, where the pandemic certainly exacerbated that a little bit, but from my experience previously, in looking at options for interventions like tutoring during the day and after school, it was there prior to the pandemic. We have an achievement gap that even through the years of implementing RTI or RTI squared in Tennessee, we haven't seen the movement that we needed to see, at least in the districts that I've been involved in. And certainly the return on investment hasn't been what it needed to be to really impact student achievement. So we're really looking to also of how we do that, that support system through the response to intervention better, but tutoring, high dosage tutoring is going to play a big part of that. I mean, addressing those students that need that more, concentrated time with an experienced tutor or trained and supported tutor, using high quality instructional materials. That's the other key component that we know is important. It's can't just be focused on skills. It has to be consistent, coherent, and supported, by some strong training and support of that tutor, that teacher, whether it's an actual teacher or it's a teacher assistant, using very effectively the materials that we have identified to be worth the student's time and the teacher's time. So if we go to the next slide, kind of segue into that, what I've just mentioned, our work is beyond just the challenges of the pandemic. It's really to transform how we better support students during the school day, even though there is still going to be a place, absolutely a place for the additional extended learning time and after school programs that we are just beginning to increase more opportunity for students in our school system. And that'll certainly help. But we have to look at that 7 hours that we have students every day in the time that we have them, and how we can ensure students certainly have access to all of those levels of support that they need individually, small groups, and supporting their teachers and the other educators in the building on best supporting students. So, the model we're looking at is really a braiding of what we're doing with response to intervention with the different tiers support, but in looking at our time and the opportunity for teachers to get in front of small groups, the low ratio, and use the high dosage techniques, high dosage tutoring techniques to really make a difference for individual students. And again, just keep emphasizing, if we feel strongly that if we don't do it during the school day, we're just not going to get the impact that we know we need to have in opportunities we need to provide to all of our students. If we can go to that last slide, or the next slide, I'm sorry. Thank you. As the benefit of working with a partner like ERS is they had a chance to look at other districts. I mean, it was mentioned Aldine, Texas, really want to look at what they're doing even deeper, but looking at how we can really manage the resources that we have control of, and that's our time during the school day. if our goal is to ensure that we provide high dosage tutoring during the school day, we can't just stick it into our schedule. We have to really look at our time, and looking at scheduling options at the different grade levels across all schools is certainly where we knew we had to begin. As we started the work, we know it's going to continue to be an iterative process where we have to improve. And time is always a factor. We never have enough time, we never have enough of it, as we all hear that, I'm sure. But I always feel we can look at what we're doing, and there's certainly opportunities to better prioritize our time, especially to align with our goals. And our goal in this conversation, of course, is providing high dosage tutoring to our students during the school day on a very consistent and full basis. So if we go to this next slide, the final slide, I believe, for us is just kind of a summary again. We want to build on the successes. I believe strongly, our team talks about it often. We're going to start small and go big. So we want to work through the process, but the worst thing we could do is do nothing. So the idea of do now and kind of grow forward or move forward and build forward certainly resonates with our team. It's all the teams that I've had a chance to be a part of. That's just been an aligned concept. So, really relate to that idea. And we just want to launch this year, this spring, in addition to our regional foundation partner that we've launched some work that's really propelled us very quickly. We want to begin launching more of that during the school day this spring. We're having small islands, so to speak, of implementing that, and then our full implementation, at least for more of our schools during the school day, will be next year. And we're going to build, continue to build from that. So I guess you would call this year the pilot year. The feedback we've gotten of our tutors that have been supported and trained and in doing the after school tutoring through the support of the Niswonger Foundation has certainly been, the feedback has been very positive. They feel like they're being effective. The data showing by the students' movement and growth through that direct support and that high dosage tutoring is very encouraging. Again, we want to make sure we use those successes, and we want to replicate that on a very consistent, regular basis in all of our schools every day. So, certainly building off the lessons we're learning right now and the great support that we have. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, just a little earlier, it's about the students. It always is, but we need to make sure that our teachers are supported in the best way possible, not only to make the tutoring efforts successful, but the instruction that happens every day and all of the other relationship building that needs to happen. We have to make sure that our teachers are well trained and well supported, whether it's specifically in high dosage tutoring, and then also we have to make sure they have the materials and resources they need to sustain it and be successful as well for every student. So very excited about the work. We are just beginning. I want to clarify that. I mean, I don't know that you would consider us a model, other than we're in the stage that we're doing now, and we're going to continue to build forward from lessons learned, not just in our own district, certainly going to keep in tune with all of the other districts that are doing similar work and powerful work, and we want to leverage all of that collective success and experience to improve for our students in Washington County.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you so much. I know so many leaders in Tennessee are trying to plan for this right now, and you all, your team, you're tackling the tough issues and trying to follow research on this. So thank you so much for what you're doing. I again want to thank Superintendent Hassell and Superintendent Boyd for sharing their reflections and about their work. It's work actually, and it's happening right now, and as they're building for the future. It's so important to hear and valuable to hear how you're innovating with your ESSER dollars and thinking about sustainability and transparency with your stakeholders. Welcome back, David. Glad that you've joined us again. Back to the conversation now. We're going to take some time to respond to some questions that have been submitted. I want to remind people who are listening, if you haven't submitted a question yet and you'd like to, use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll spend the next few few minutes answering some of those questions. Before we dig into some of those questions, David, I want to turn to you as others are having a little time to form some more questions and put those in the chat feature for us. I'd love for you to reflect first on Joey and Jerry's, what they shared today. Given what you've seen across the country, what stands out to you in Haywood County Schools and Washington County Schools?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a couple things I would highlight, and I do think that for Superintendent Boyd and Superintendent Hassell, the work you're doing is inspirational to the rest of us. So one thing that really sticks with me and sticks with us in the work is that the team took time to ensure that what they were doing was grounded in a vision of where they want to be, not just addressing the needs that exist today. Right, it's real easy to say, okay, we got kids who are behind, let's just get them some time, or we've got teachers who are leaving, let's figure out how we retain them. But the work here is building towards something that says this is a thing that if it works well and we think it can, we will sustain it in both cases. And so I think that's powerful. And then I think the other thing I would name is, like, while pursuing a pilot, right? And I think Superintendent Boyd, you called it that. It is clear that this work is not on the side. It is not, just another, around the system effort. It is not a thing that we'll just sort of, throw across the transom and see what sticks. Like, there's a sense of looking to see what's happening, making adjustments as you go, recognizing it's not going to necessarily be right the first time. And it's almost a go slow to go fast kind of approach that when you look at change in education or any organization that works. And so I think those are hallmarks of the approach here that these leaders, you guys have been so thoughtful with your teams in taking.
Thanks, David. We have a question for Joey. The question is, when determining which four-year universities to partner with regards to the Grow Your Own program, how did you and your team finalize which universities to work with? And then it goes on. Was your decision to partner with these specific universities driven by the district's focus to increase the teacher pipeline with educators of color? And then thanks for sharing, from Dexter Murphy.
All right. Thanks, Dexter. For us, proximity with UT Martin and the University of Memphis obviously drove, that work. Plus, we have established partnerships with them. However, we are strongly considering the work with Tennessee State. Our community has a large number of TSU alum, and TSU also is an HBCU, and they focus a lot of support for our students as they transition to post-secondary. So their selection was a big part of us thinking about our desire to meet that diversity goal, that we have, and the established partnership in the way they've supported us in other endeavors.
Thanks, Joey. All right, a question now for everyone. David, how are you advising districts? And Joey and Jerry, how are you working to strike a balance between leveraging your ESSER dollars to meet the acute needs of students that are most deeply impacted by the pandemic right now versus thinking about sustainability once funds expire?
Yeah, I actually defer to the superintendents first. No, I would defer to the superintendents first. I'm very curious here, because this idea of how do you tend gardens and put out fires is how we've talked about it, is a challenge everywhere that we work.
Yeah, Jerry, I'll tackle this, then pass it to you. I think for us, when we developed our initial ESSER plan, even with 1 and 2, we were thinking sustainability, and we know, hiring people and then not having a plan to sustain that can create a challenge. However, we did make some decisions to bring staff on. We made an intentional decision this first year to drive class size down, just because we were bringing students back to a full everyday school year. We wanted to create an opportunity for for class sizes to be smaller. But in doing so, we had thought about year 2 and that we're going to actually up class size and pull out, and not spend that. So we actually have a plan in place. And one way we're doing that in lower elementary is we are looking at onboarding EAs to drive the ratio down in the classroom. Cost is something we can manage within our own budget, but it also feeds that grow your own kind of thing that we're looking at of getting them in school. So that's just one example. That may have been clear as mud, but that's one way we're looking at it. So
yeah, I mean, you have to begin with this sustainability in mind. I mean, we just started with commitments like I know Joey did and many other districts, and working with the board. So in a superintendent role, you certainly have to also work with your boards of education, which, they want what's best for kids, but they saw the money, and we had to have many discussions. We need to focus these funds. We can look at infrastructure and buildings, but we wanted a majority, if not at least 50% of it, focused on building capacity and improving, teaching and learning for students. So most of ours, we had a few, like Joey mentioned, a few opportunities, and mostly focused on social emotional supports for extra dollars to bring in, additional employees, additional supports like social workers, which we didn't really have on staff to help be that student family school liaison. We want to try to sustain that, and we're going to work towards that when the money does run out. Just kind of use it as an off ramp when we transition in 24 or after 24 to just local and state funds. But really, it's what can we didn't want to invest in things that like personnel too heavily because of that sustainability question. So most of ours are like high impact, really inject supports to make the changes we need over the next 3 years is really the conversation. And that's around the discussions around tutoring, changing practice, changing mindset, and then eventually changing structure and potentially each day and job of a teacher. But that's long-term. So that's long-term work. But we just needed that injection of momentum that we're gaining from the ESSER funds to really drive us forward when those funds are no longer available. It's about priorities. Every budget year is. It's about priorities, and you got to look at long-term and stay true to your priorities. And so we're going to continue to look at our budgets and over time and continue to ensure alignment with local and state dollars with the priorities we know that are most important for our students.
David, thoughts?
I want to name, I think that the Superintendent Boyd and Superintendent Hassell are able to create the mind space for themselves and for their teams to have these conversations. And so I want to just name that is incredibly challenging in any community, particularly in the last couple of years, but the teams are doing it. And where you're able to do that, it opens up some tremendous opportunities. I think the last thing I'll just say though is that when you're running a system, all the gravity pulls you back to status quo, right? Like all the inertia is just going to be there. And so what I hear from Superintendent Boyd and Superintendent Hassell is this recognition, like we're gonna keep moving, right? We're gonna play the long game here. We're gonna get the work done. We're gonna operate with urgency, but we're still gonna be playing for what is it gonna look like in the future. And I do think that we don't talk a lot about the gifts of the last couple of years because most of what the last couple of years has made life tragically challenging. But the gift of the money and the time in which we are enabled to use it really does open the door to the kind of work that we're hearing about today. So it's very exciting.
David, let me build upon that with another question that we have. And, when you were talking earlier today in thinking about challenging us to, thinking about reinvention, pursuing reinvention. And I know that So many of us just would love to go back to the way it was before 2020, March of 2020, and those kinds of things. And that's my own worry inside, is that we won't take those lessons learned and education won't change or be different. Can you tell us what you're seeing from other districts across the country, or your team's thinking around how should districts really even lean in more to pursuing reinvention and rethinking past even their ESSER funds that they're going to have?
Yeah, it's a great question and challenge. I think part of it is, district teams that are saying and being willing to say, we didn't have it all figured out in 2019. So while going back to the way it was before might feel good and sort of feel like it's simplifying the work, it's, we know now what the last 2 years were like, but before we got into it, we weren't sitting pretty and resting on our laurels. So I think there's that. And then I guess the other piece of this is, like, it is an opportunity for a little bit of a reset in terms of some of the battles or the challenges or the things that were just endemic to the work before, right? If you feel like you've had a rough go, with working with your teachers association, and you are able to use this opportunity to pivot and say, this is not just about appreciation in terms of, a retention stipend, but this is about really thinking differently about what your job looks like, because we believe in you, we want you to be successful, and that's not just lip service. We get to do that. So I think we're seeing, leaders who are trying to use this as a reset, not just in words, but actually in deed of what is going forward, with a recognition that, look, we are not reinventing the wheel on what works. We are starting with the research, right? And so that also gives us a little bit of a roadmap, hopefully.
Right. Thank you. Thank you all. I wish we had another 5 minutes or so to dig into some more questions, but I know we're at time. So I can't thank you enough for joining us, for being presenters today with us. And I want to thank all of our participants for being with us today. Thank you for submitting questions, and we really appreciate our guests, David, Joey, and Jerry, for sharing their strategies and reflections about teacher pipeline, high-dosage tutoring strategies, and other thoughts that can endure beyond the infusion of ESSER funds. I'm hopeful that others are able to build upon their experiences and the things that they've shared as everyone's reflecting on how to plan and support student learning now as we recover from the pandemic and then beyond. Before we conclude today, I'd like to highlight some planning resources that our SCORE team will share with those of you on the call with us today in a follow-up email in the next couple of days. First, if you have questions regarding this webinar or would like to connect with the SCORE team, we'd love to speak with you. There will be a link in the follow-up email that will allow you to sign up for a time to meet with us and talk about your situation. Secondly, we'll be sharing SCORE's high-dosage tutoring planning and implementation guide that provides a focused synopsis of what the research says about high-quality tutoring program, and should include as well as templates and resources that can work toward that vision. And finally, we'll share a link to SCORE's ESSER spending dashboard, where you can get a high-level view of district spending trends in Tennessee. As we close out today, I'd like to invite you to attend SCORE's fourth and final institute for the spring series, Momentum Metrics for Greater Post-Secondary Success, that will be held on Wednesday, May 25th at 11 a.m. Central Time. As we get closer to that date, you'll receive an invitation with registration information. I look forward to hearing from everyone who attended this webinar and hope you'll join us for our next institute. As we emerge from this pandemic, we have a critical window of opportunity to rebuild and reimagine how we can truly support all students. And I'm grateful for the hard work and the thoughtfulness that you are each investing to ensure that all of our students get exactly what they need to be successful. Thank you for joining us again. Thank you for the hard work that you do every day on behalf of students. And we hope that you have a great rest of the week.